Yes, welcome to another lesson. This time I want to talk about the Hyksos of Egypt and how there's evidence that the Hyksos were Edomites. Certain scholars mention that more specifically they were Amalekites. Also based on that connection between the Edomites and the connection between Job and the Edomites and the tribe of Issachar. Based on that connection, it can be demonstrated, and of course based on the scriptures, it can be demonstrated that Balaam was not actually a Gentile prophet. Although he himself thought he was an Aramean, a Gentile, he was actually a descendant of the tribe of Issachar, which is something that coincides with Amos chapter 3, where it says that Yahweh reveals the secrets to his servants. The prophets and his servants are Israelites. That's what I want to talk about in this lesson. There are several articles and books. You can copy the link to this book and this article here, but if you can't copy it, I'll leave it in the description. Here's this book called Edom and the Hyksos by David Gibson. He does a fairly extensive study of why he considers, based on the evidence, based on historians, on the descriptions of historians and the evidence that exists, that they were Edomites, and he has several points here to compare the descriptions of the Edomites. Here he has 6 racial descriptions of the Hyksos, and he considers that they only fit the Edomites. And here he says, based on the descriptions of historians, they are considered an Asiatic people, not Egyptian. They are considered barbarians, of a lower culture than the Egyptians. They are considered as Arab-like nomadic shepherds. They are considered to be of Canaanite descent, since, as you know, Esau married women from Canaan. They are considered Semites. Of course, the Edomites are descendants of Shem. In fact, they are Hebrews, only that they are not Israelites. They are Edomite Hebrews. And their language, besides being Hebrew, had hints of the Horite language. If you know, according to the book of Genesis, after the blessing was given to Jacob and not to Esau, Esau moved to the land of the Horites, and from there, that's where he gets his language with a hint of Horite. And also, many people confuse the Hyksos with the Israelites because Edom is Jacob's brother. Those are several interesting points that he brings up here in this book, and I'm going to talk to you about that in more detail right now. But I also wanted to mention that this book has several errors. Not everything is correct. For example, the author says that the Horites and the Edomites were not cavemen. When the book of Job says otherwise, the evidence says otherwise, that the Edomites, in their beginnings and also during their low times, in the Middle Ages, when they fall into poverty, always become cavemen. And this author sort of denies that Edomite descent, because in a certain way, this author David Gibson sort of mentions the Edomites with a certain pride, and he mentions them as a great nation that cannot be denied that apart from the fact that they are evil, it cannot be denied that they were not just any nation, they were important. But here he denies that the Edomites were cavemen and also confuses Job with Jobab and considers Job an Edomite. That is another error. But apart from those errors, I did not see any major errors in his study that he equated the Hyksos to the Edomites. And another thing he mentions, and there are several historians who agree with that, is that the Hyksos introduced horses, carts, chariots, bows, swords, and all that to Egypt. This coincides with the blessing of Esau, that the blessing of Esau is war, the sword. So, when they invaded Egypt, at the time they invaded Egypt, the tribe of Issachar reigned. If you look at my lesson on the pyramids based on the book of Job, based on other scholars I mentioned there in that lesson, when the Hyksos took over Egypt, the tribe of Issachar was reigning in Egypt. So, when they invaded the tribe of Issachar, they introduced these methods of warfare to Egypt. And after they were expelled from Egypt, the descendants of Mizraim or the original Egyptians adopted these methods of warfare. And here it mentions that the Hyksos introduced various methods of warfare to the kingdom of Egypt. And another interesting thing he mentions here, you can read it, the study is quite extensive. What he mentions here is that when the Edomites invade Job's kingdom and take control of Egypt, they make their capital in Avaris, which is in the Egyptian delta. And that doesn't make sense when you invade a kingdom. For example, when, let's say, the Persians, when they invaded Lydia and when they invaded Egypt, they didn't make Egypt their new capital. And also when, let's say, when Babylon invaded Israel, they didn't make Israel their new capital. So, why did the Hyksos make Egypt their new capital when they invaded Egypt? And that has to do with the fact that the Edomites lived in the land of the Horites, which, according to this book, is mentioned, according to archaeology, when they moved to the land of the Horites, which was a land of caves, a desert land. They didn't develop it much. So, when the Hyksos invaded the kingdom of Job and the Egyptians, when they invaded this new kingdom, it was better for them to make their capital in Egypt than in Edom, which was an undeveloped land, and from there they could better control Egypt. That's another clue that they were the Edomites. There are quite a few clues. There are even very slight archaeological clues that they were Edomites. There are paintings in the tomb of a pharaoh named Seti, which depicts the different races that exist in Egypt or that existed at one time, because it is also mentioned in another book. In another book of the Amalekites, it is mentioned that the Hyksos were Amalekites. It's mentioned that the Amalekites, after they were expelled by King Amhos, I believe, and after they enslaved the Israelites left Egypt, and the Amalekites returned to Egypt and invaded again. They invaded Egypt again, and that's why King Saul had to attack the Amalekites, because they were a power, because they were in Egypt. It's mentioned that they returned again. So, this tomb of this Pharaoh Seti is a more modern tomb. It's from after the Exodus, but he mentions different types of people who were in Egypt. He doesn't mention them. He draws them in relief, and you can see that there are white people. And what's interesting is that at one time you could see the white people in the reliefs, but they've since removed them. They've erased them. And you see here these white people who were here, who were the Hyksos who existed at one time in Egypt. You can't see them anymore. They've already erased them. But these were these two types of people, and some even had tattoos. Look how pale they are, and the tattoos. Only the Edomites used that type of tattoos. And you can see in the time of the Scythians, who were the first Edomites who began to empower themselves, the mummies of the Scythians who were Edomites show first that they were white, and second that they used tattoos too. Very similar to these reliefs, these photos or these reliefs that are in the tomb of Seti, very similar to that. And here another thing that is mentioned here in this book of Edom and the Hyksos is that when they expelled them, which many people confuse, there were two expulsions of the Hyksos. The first expulsion was when they were expelled after they invaded the Issachar tribe. When the Hyksos were expelled the first time, they retreated toward Petra, and there is evidence of that as well. Here he mentions it. They retreated toward Petra and developed that city, and they left artifacts of Egyptian things in Petra. Here he mentions it in this chapter, the last chapter, that after being expelled, they founded Petra. They had already gone to Petra, but there is no evidence that they had built anything. And here he mentions that evidence of construction in Petra didn't exist until after the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt. And he also mentions that confusion there is with, what is it called? That confusion there is between the Edomites and the Nabateans. Here he also clarifies that yes, the Nabateans in the future after the Edomites, in more modern times, for example, the times from Rome, yes, there were Nabateans who were Arabs, but before the Nabateans, those who founded Petra were Edomites after the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt the first time. They founded Petra and developed Petra, and in Petra, they left evidence of Egyptian influence. And also here it mentions that they learned to work stone from the tribe of Issachar. Here it says Egypt, but if you know the history, they invaded the tribe of Issachar, and those who built the pyramids were the tribe of Issachar. So, they, the Edomites/Hyksos, learned to work stone and founded Petra thanks to the tribe of Issachar and thanks to Job. And there is also evidence in Petra where their kings, who in the Bible are called dukes. In Petra there are mentions of pharaohs, who they considered their kings pharaohs. So, there are connections between Petra and Egypt after the Hyksos were expelled. And there's also, as I say here, this article by Debbie Hearn, the Hyksos returned to Egypt and invaded Egypt again after the Israelites left. And that was the reason Samuel had to attack the Amalekites, because when the Amalekites invaded Egypt the second time, if you look at this article here, when they invaded the second time they drove out the Hyksos, they didn't go to Petra. The second time when they drove out the Amalekites, they went to a place. It mentions the name here. I'm not quite sure, but that place isn't in Petra, it's in the land of Benjamin. So, when they were driven out the second time, it was during the time of Saul. When they drove them out, the Amalekites, sort of in an emergency, they had to go to the land of Judah. So, as it were, they were invading the land of Judah, and that's why Saul had to attack the Amalekites. And another interesting point that this book mentions here is that in the Exodus, during the Exodus, and I always thought, why does it mention that in the prophetic books? In fact, I'm going to look it up here. I always wondered why in the book of Revelation it mentions that when the Messiah returns, why are we going to sing the Song of Moses? Here in Revelation 15 verse 3 it says, "And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty." But if you look at how it says here in this book, the real connection of why the Song of Moses is sung when the Messiah returns is because the Edomites are going to be reigning in the last days, as it says in the 4th book of Ezra, chapter 6, verse 9. And since the Edomites are going to be reigning in the last days, here it makes that connection that in the book of Exodus 15, from verse 14 to 16. In fact, we are going to see it here in the book of Exodus 15. It mentions that the dukes of Edom shall be amazed, the mighty men of Moab, trembling shall take hold upon them. All the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. And here in this book it mentions that if Edom was nothing during the Exodus, why would Edom have to be mentioned? Edom was already a great nation at the time of the Exodus because they were the Hyksos pharaohs. Likewise, as it says in Revelation 15, in verse 3, also, in the book of Revelation, during the return of the Messiah, Edom is going to be a great nation. In fact, Edom is going to be the one that is reigning over the world during the end times. So, it also mentions that connection there in that book, and it also mentions it in the book of Ezekiel. Well, you can read, but what I found interesting also is that the book of Ezekiel mentions among the great nations mentions Edom, and in the time of Ezekiel it was not considered. Well, people do not consider. In reality, they do not consider Edom as a great nation because Edom in reality was not a great nation until the Greeks. But what they don't understand is that Edom was already a great nation because they were the Hyksos, the pharaohs of Egypt, and then also in the time of Ezekiel, there were also the Scythians who were already mentioned in the time of Ezekiel as a great nation. Here they are on page 81 of this book mentions that Ezekiel in chapter 32 verse 17 to 32 mentions Ezekiel the great nations of that time and mentions the Assyrians. He mentions Meshech and Tubal, which is in the area of Turkey and Edom. In verse 29, let's see it. Ezekiel 32, right? Right. Look, Ezekiel 32, verse 29. There Edom, its kings and all its princes. So it says that Edom is mentioned among a list of great nations in Ezekiel's time. And that doesn't make sense if they didn't have a kingdom like the Hyksos. Because in Ezekiel's time, as I tell you, the Edomites didn't have a kingdom until the Greeks. Here he also mentions the Scythians, who, as I tell you, the Scythians were Edomites too. And another interesting thing that he mentions is that during the Exodus, when Moses wrote the books of Genesis and all the books of Moses, he mentions Edom in more detail than any other race. And he mentions the kings of Edom, the dukes, which implies that by the time of the Exodus, Edom already had kings. And if you really notice, what he mentions here in this book about the Hyksos and the Edomites is that during the time that Moses wrote the books of Genesis, he mentions other descendants like Ishmael. He only dedicated 7 verses to them, similarly to the Canaanites. He only dedicated 6 verses to them, but he dedicated an entire chapter to the Edomites, chapter 36. And what he mentions here in this book is that he says that by the time of Moses, and if you watch the video of the pyramids, everything makes more sense. And you realize that these dukes, these Edomite kings, were the Hyksos. There is no other explanation. And what he mentions here about the dukes of Edom, and what he mentions here in this book about the dukes of Edom in Genesis 36, is that by the time of the Exodus, the Edomites already had kings who were clearly the Hyksos. You have to notice something very interesting. The first king of the Edomites was not an Edomite. And here it says in Genesis 36, verse 31, "And the kings who reigned in the land of Edom." If you look at the story in the book of Job and the video about the Edomites, Job expanded his territory beyond Egypt to include the land of Edom. That's why, at the beginning of the book, he mentions that he lived in the land of Uz, which is the land of Edom. So, the kings of the Edomites began with Job's kingdom. And this is where Balaam fits in. You'll see right now. So, Job's kingdom included the land of Edom. The first kings of the land of Edom, or pharaohs in that case, the first pharaohs of the land of Edom were from the tribe of Issachar. They were Job and his sons, who were descendants of Issachar. That is if you understand the book of Job. If you understand that Job was pharaoh of Egypt, look at that lesson from the pyramids. Bela, son of Beor. This is the first time Beor is mentioned. The other time Beor is mentioned is Balaam. Balaam is considered a son of Beor, and this Beor is a mystery, unless you know the history of Job and know that Job reigned over the land of Edom before the Edomites. So this Beor has a connection to Job's family. This could possibly be a title for Job's family, or it could be something that connects the first kings of Edom with the family of Issachar. So this Beor had to be a descendant, if not of Job, then of Issachar. And there's that connection. If you know the story of Job and how he was actually, what's his name? King Cheops, who built the pyramid of Egypt and whose kingdom extended into Edom. So the first king was this one, a descendant of Beor, which was possibly like a title, who were from the tribe of Issachar. So the first king of Edom was not Edomite. And they say that this king descended from Issachar. His city was called Danibah, possibly a place in Egypt. And after this king died, if you look at the book of Job, this death had to do with the Hyksos, who hired the sons of Cush to invade the kingdom of Issachar. That is, after they hired the sons of Cush to invade the kingdom of Issachar, then the Edomites reigned. And here he mentions the Edomites after the king of Issachar died, and Job's kingdom fell, which controlled the land of Edom. And after that, the Hyksos began to control Egypt and the land of Edom. The first Edomite king was called Jobab. He was a son of Zerah of Bozrah. This is the first king of the Hyksos, or Pharaoh, Jobab. And in this book, as I tell you, one of the mistakes he makes here is that he considers Jobab as Job. And no, nothing to do with it. Job was the one who reigned before, who was possibly considered Beor a title. He was Beor. And then the kings of Edom began, Jobab. And after Jobab died, here it says the kingdom of Husham, one of the land of Taman. As I tell you, here he dedicates an entire chapter to the Edomites. And what's interesting is that when he mentions Beor, the other time he mentions Beor is in the book of Numbers, which was also during the time of Moses during the Exodus. So, during the Exodus, several names were mentioned that were later understood to be titles, and now I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So, Beor was like a title for Job of Issachar. The first king of the land of Edom wasn't an Edomite, he was from Issachar. And this Balaam considered himself a son of Beor, and he wasn't necessarily a direct son. That is, he was like the Israelites are considered sons of Jacob. So, Balaam, knowing that Beor was possibly a title for the family of Issachar, didn't even know that himself, right? Not even he knew it. Balaam was considered a descendant of these kings of Edom. And if you know history well, you have to know the history of Job, and how Job was the first to reign in Edom and wasn't an Edomite. If you understand that, then you understand that Balaam was neither Edomite nor Aramean, because other people also consider Balaam possibly a descendant of Edom, and many Arameans lived in Edom. The Kenite were Arameans. So, the connection he has was between Edom or an Aramean. That's what people consider, but they don't know that the first king of Edom was not an Edomite, but was from the tribe of Issachar. So this Balaam, having this title, a descendant of Beor, whom even he himself considered to be of Gentile descent, didn't know that Beor was actually a descendant of Issachar, and that Balaam is actually from the tribe of Issachar, the tribe of the Mexicans today. I have another lesson there where it is mentioned that they also mention in Exodus 3 that Moses and his father-in-law Jethro, a priest of Midian. Jethro considered himself a Kenite. Also here in the Bible, it is mentioned that Jethro considered himself a Kenite. Here in the book of Judges, chapter 4, verse 11, it says, "Of the sons of Hobab, Moses' father-in-law, he had separated from the Kenite and pitched his tent unto the plain of Zanaim, which is by Kadesh." So, a lot of people think that Jethro was like a son of Cush or a Canaanite, but he was actually an Aramean. But if you look at history, he lived in the land of Arabia, and he considered himself an Aramean or a Kenite. A Kenite, if you look in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 2 and verse 55, it says here that the Kenite originally came from Hamath, which is in Syria, so they were Arameans. And it also mentions in the first book of Samuel, chapter 15, verse 6, that the Kenite always lived among the Edomites. So from the time of Job, when he moved to the land of Edom, the Kenite already existed in the land of Edom. So, the descendants of Job must have existed around the land of Edom, included Balaam, but also possibly included Jethro, who, as I tell you, was a Kenite who lived among the Edomites, among the Amalekites. If you look at history, Jethro was actually a Kenite and they were considered to be of Aramean origin. So Balaam, being a descendant of those lands of Edom, possibly considered himself either an Edomite or an Aramean because of the connection there is between the Kenite and those who lived in the land of Edom, as it says in the first book of Samuel, chapter 15, in verse 6. And as I said, here in this other article about the Amalekites by Debbie Hearn, one interesting thing she mentions is that she considers that they returned to Egypt again after the Exodus and took control of Egypt again. And when they were expelled again, they invaded the south of Judah. And that's when Saul had to fight the Amalekites. And another interesting thing is that the first time King Agag is mentioned is in the time of Moses during the Exodus, when Balaam mentions Agag in Numbers 24 as a great nation shortly after the Exodus. So after that, Agag is not mentioned until the time of Samuel, and after that, until the time of the Persians, in the time of the book of Esther. If you look, Agag was actually a title, not a person. Agag was a title that goes back to the time of the Edomite Hyksos pharaohs. So, when in Numbers 24, they were, as I tell you, there are several articles and several scholars who consider that among all the Edomites, they were Amalekites. So, in the time of Balaam, shortly after the Exodus, in the time of Balaam, Edom considered a great nation because of Agag and the Hyksos. Now it makes sense, because otherwise why would he mention Agag? If Agag is not mentioned as king until about 300 years later, in the time of Samuel. Because Agag was the title of the kings of the Hyksos or the Amalekites from the time of the Exodus. That's what's significant about Agag in the book of Numbers 24 verse 7. So, by the time of Samuel, when he was attacking the Amalekites, if you look here at the article on the Amalekites, these Amalekites had been expelled from Egypt again. So again they had that title of Agag, which was like their version of Pharaoh. Agag is their title of Pharaoh. So, that's why the book of Samuel says that he attacked the Amalekites, but didn't kill the king, that Agag is like a title for a king. And if you know, if Agag was the title of a pharaoh, then Agag wasn't a normal person. He was the pharaoh. And at any time, pharaohs had children from many women. That's why when they say he killed the Amalekites, as many as they could, because of course, he couldn't kill everyone. All those who had invaded the land of Judah, he killed them, except for Pharaoh Agag. But then Samuel kills Pharaoh Agag. So, people might ask, how is it possible that in the time of the Persians, descendants of this king Agag are mentioned again when Samuel supposedly killed him? If you realize, Agag was a pharaoh who could have had descendants scattered throughout the world. What's more, here in these books and articles, it is mentioned that the Hyksos came to reign as far as the land of Crete in the Greek world. That is, he possibly could have left his descendants scattered throughout the Greek world. And although Samuel killed Pharaoh Agag, his descendants could have already been scattered throughout the Greek world. That's what's interesting about knowing first that the Hyksos were Amalekites or Edomites, and that in Genesis 36 when it mentions the kings of Edom, they were actually the pharaohs of Egypt, the Hyksos. And at the time of the Exodus, when the book of Numbers was written, this idea of the Amalekite pharaoh Agag already existed, which is like a title. Then it is mentioned in the book of Numbers 24, which is a prophetic book by Balaam. Another day I'll do an analysis of that chapter, Numbers 24, but Numbers 24 mentions a contrast between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the Amalekites, which curiously, when the Exodus happened, the Amalekites were powerful because of the Hyksos. And when the Messiah returns, the Amalekites are powerful again because they are the world elite of today. The Amalekites and Agag would be like a title that would be like the kings among the Amalekites, or the elite among the Amalekites would be Agag. So, what it says here, Numbers 24 mentions that the kingdom of God is going to be much better than the kingdom of Agag. In Numbers 24, in verse 7, here it says, "He shall pour the water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. And his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted." Why mention Agag at this time, when supposedly King Agag didn't exist until 300 years later? As I said, this Agag was a title of the Hyksos pharaohs that Balaam prophesied. If you continue reading here, Balaam prophesied that these people of Agag or the Amalekites were going to be very powerful until the end, until the return of the Messiah. But the kingdom of God was going to be much greater than the kingdom of the Amalekites today, of the world's elite. And I also wanted to mention that at their peak, here's a map. At their peak, the Hyksos covered a territory from the Euphrates River to the Nile River. Even, as I said, Agag could have had descendants all the way back to the Greek world because the Hyksos reached as far as Crete. So what I find curious is that the Hyksos actually claimed the blessing that Yahweh gave to Abraham in Genesis 15 and verse 18, where he told him that on that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham, saying to your descendants, I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, which if you understand, the descendants are not just any descendants. It is not Ishmael. It is not Edom. It is for Jacob. And these Amalekites in the time of the Hyksos took that blessing from the Nile River to the Euphrates River, which is the blessing that was for the descendants of Abraham. The Hyksos took that land, and what I find curious is that today the Amalekites, under that same excuse, they call it Greater Israel. They are invading these lands. They want their territory to reach from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River, just like the Amalekites' Hyksos. Once again, the Amalekites are trying to seize something that doesn't belong to them. They aren't the Israelites. They are the Amalekites, just like the Hyksos and the Greeks. They are Agag, the Hyksos pharaohs. I find it interesting that they want that territory again. Once again, the great Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates. Well, I hope you learned something. As I said, I'll leave you the links to these books in the description, but it's more evidence that the Hyksos were Amalekites, and also that Balaam was a descendant of Issachar and possibly even Jethro. Moses' father-in-law was a descendant of Issachar.